Hayley Dunn was a 13-year-old teenager from Big Spring, a small town in Texas. On December 27, 2010, her routine, familiar life was shattered beyond recognition. Like many girls her age, Hayley was at a transitional point in her life. Raised by her mother, Billy Dunn, after a tumultuous divorce, she spent her time alternating between visits to her father's house and spending time with her friends. Her relationship with her father was distant, neither particularly close nor strained. That day, like any other, Hayley woke up, went to school, had casual conversations with her friends, and in the late afternoon began preparations for a visit to her father's house. The neighborhood Hayley lived in was simple and quiet, with modest homes surrounded by carefully tended gardens. There was nothing remarkable at first glance about the area. A standard suburban street where families lived their daily lives without any apparent sense of the looming horror that was about to unfold. Hayley's house, a wooden structure with peeling paint and an uneven roof, blended in with the rest. It was just another house, another family following their routines, unaware that in those fleeting moments, the course of Hayley's life was being determined somewhere out of their control. When Hayley told her mother she was going to her father's house and later meeting a friend, it was an ordinary farewell. The kind of goodbye any mother would exchange with her child, unaware that it would be the last moment of normalcy she would experience. Billy watched her daughter walk out the door, as any mother would, not knowing that in those brief seconds her world would be altered forever. Hayley stepped out of the house, backpack slung over her shoulders, carrying what seemed like the weight of the day. Billy didn't realize that in that moment, her daughter was heading toward a fate she couldn't predict. There was nothing unusual about Hayley's behavior that day. She was calm, composed. She was going to visit her father, and then have some fun with her friends. No one could have predicted that this small act would mark the beginning of something far darker. Yet, as with so many stories of disappearances, there was an eerie feeling in the air. A feeling like a faint light that flickered in Billy's mind hours after her daughter had left. Something didn't feel right. At first, Billy tried to push away the discomfort, thinking her daughter had simply gotten distracted or decided to stay longer at her father's house or with a friend. But as the afternoon wore on and the evening approached, a chill began to settle in. Something wasn't adding up. Hayley hadn't come home. Billy's first attempt to call her daughter came around 6:30 p.m. The voicemail was the only response. Billy, trying to stay calm, rationalized the situation. Maybe Hayley had gone out to hang with friends or stayed longer at her father's. After all, it was common for teenagers to want to spend time away from their parents. But as the hours passed, Billy's unease grew. What should have been a simple visit to her father was turning into something more ominous. Night fell and the emptiness of the house began to press in on Billy. Despite trying to keep a composed exterior, the tension inside her was building. She called Hayley's phone again, but the call went straight to voicemail once more. She then called her ex-husband. The conversation was brief and uneventful. Hayley hadn't arrived at his house. No one knew where she was. The panic began to seep in. Billy had no idea where her daughter had gone, but something was horribly wrong. Hayley wasn't the type of girl who would just disappear without a word. The next calls came faster, more urgent, but they all ended in the same result: voicemail. Billy tried calling some of Hayley's close friends, asking if they had seen her. Maybe she's just out for longer than expected, one friend suggested. Teenagers do that sometimes. But the feeling that something serious was happening wouldn't leave Billy. She drove around town, knocking on the doors of Hayley's friends, asking if they had seen her. There was no sign of her. No one knew where Hayley had gone. As the night stretched on, the silence in the house grew heavier. The sound of the clock ticking seemed to grow louder with every minute that passed. Billy tried to sleep, but the hours seemed endless. The absence of Hayley, the lack of her voice, her laughter, was suffocating. Every tick of the clock pulled Billy deeper into a growing fear. The house felt like a tomb, the air thick with an unsettling sense of loss. The first night without Hayley was one of the longest in Billy's life. She tried to sleep, but the anxiety kept her wide awake. The emptiness of the house, the quiet, the absence of her daughter, it was all consuming. The minutes dragged on, and with every passing second, Billy's worst suspicions began to take root. Her daughter wasn't just out of sight for a while. Something terrible had happened. By the morning of December 28th, the sun's rays seemed colder than usual. The new day brought with it more questions than answers. Billy knew she couldn't wait any longer. Hayley wasn't just out of town. She was missing, and something had to be done. The first thing Billy did was call the police. but the relief she had hoped for didn't come. The police, upon hearing Billy's account, promised to look into the matter, but as the hours stretched into days, nothing significant came. The feeling of helplessness, of waiting, gnawed at Billy. She had to accept with a painful clarity that her daughter was gone. The investigation had begun, but at that moment, all Billy had was the silence of an empty house and the heavy weight of her worst fears. Her daughter was gone, and the dread of never seeing her again settled deep in her heart. What followed would be a relentless search, but also a journey through a maze of secrets, lies, and outside pressures, elements that would shape the tragedy in ways no one could foresee. The first signs of an investigation were being set in motion, but for now, all Billy had was the void in her home and the fear that her daughter might never return. As the days following Hayley's disappearance dragged on, the tension surrounding her case continued to intensify. Each moment was marked by growing uncertainty, both for those closest to Hayley and the investigators working tirelessly to uncover the truth. The investigation, still in its early stages, was becoming a storm of questions and few answers. The characters at the heart of this story, particularly Hayley's family, began to unravel under the weight of suspicion and desperation. Billy Dunn, Hayley's mother, was a woman defined by love and strength. Throughout her life, she had fought to provide for her daughter, raising her in a world that was often far less than ideal. Divorced from Hayley's father, Billy had learned to navigate life alone, bolstered by her unwavering bond with her daughter. They were a team, an inseparable duo in a world that sometimes felt too large and too unforgiving. Hayley's disappearance, then, wasn't just the loss of a child. It was the loss of a part of Billy's very self. Despite her tough exterior, Billy was vulnerable. As a mother, her love for Hayley was all-encompassing. This deep affection, however, began to blur the lines between hope and reality. In the early days of Hayley's disappearance, Billy clung to the idea that her daughter had simply run away, or had decided to stay with a friend longer than expected. It was easier to believe that, to hope that the situation was just a misunderstanding. But as the days went on and the search failed to yield results, Billy's resolve started to crack. Her internal conflict was palpable. On one hand, she wanted to believe that her daughter would return. On the other, the reality was slowly sinking in. Hayley might not be coming back. The world around her became increasingly hostile, with rumors and whispers turning against her. In a small town like Big Spring, everyone knew everyone's business. And Billy, the mother of the missing girl, became an object of scrutiny. Her every word and gesture were analyzed. The community that once saw her as a hard-working, devoted mother now questioned her every action, as if somehow her pain was a cover for something more sinister. The police too began to treat Billy with suspicion. It was a natural part of any investigation, but to a grieving mother, it felt like an assault. They weren't just searching for her daughter. They were searching for the answers she didn't have. At first, Billy tried to be cooperative, answering every question with the patience of a mother who was still in shock. But as the months went by, the pressure mounted. Billy had to endure the public's judgment and the accusations from some that she had somehow been involved in her daughter's disappearance. Some in town whispered that she knew more than she was letting on, that she was hiding something. These allegations haunted Billy, a mother who would never have harmed her child but was now caught in a web of doubt and suspicion. Hayley's father, Clint Dunn, was a man caught between worlds. Estranged from Billy for years, his relationship with his daughter had always been distant, a shadow of what a father-daughter bond should be. When Hayley went missing, Clint's role in the investigation became murky. He was initially seen as a potential source of answers, but his lack of emotional involvement and erratic behavior raised questions. He had been quick to claim that he had not seen Hayley that day, but his detachment made his statements seem cold, almost rehearsed. In a case that was rife with uncertainties, his apparent indifference to his daughter's disappearance only fueled the suspicion that he might be involved in some way. Clint's initial reluctance to cooperate fully with the authorities only added to the growing concern. Was it apathy or guilt? Investigators couldn't tell, but the lack of clarity surrounding Clint's actions, his inconsistent statements, his failure to show the concern expected from a father, left many wondering whether he was hiding something. The local community too began to speculate. Was Clint involved in some way? Had he known more about his daughter's life than he was willing to admit? As the investigation moved forward, Clint's place in the narrative became more central, and the possibility of his involvement in the tragedy loomed larger. The fractured nature of Clint's relationship with his daughter became a painful point of reflection for Billy. She had always wished for a better dynamic between them. but now she wondered whether Hayley had ever truly been safe, emotionally or physically, in Clint's presence. As the investigation deepened, the law enforcement officers assigned to Hayley's case found themselves entangled in a web of uncertainty. The disappearance of a young girl is always a heavy burden on the police force, but this case was particularly frustrating. Hayley had vanished without a trace, and there were no immediate leads. No one had seen anything unusual. There were no signs of forced entry into the house and no indication of a struggle. The absence of concrete evidence left the police with little to go on. The first few days of the investigation were focused on interviewing people in Hayley's life. Friends, family, acquaintances. They spoke to Hayley's teachers, her friends, her neighbors. Everyone had their own version of events, their own suspicions, but no one had any solid information. The town of Big Spring, usually quiet and predictable, had become a place full of whispers and unanswered questions. For the police, there was a creeping sense of frustration. They had an obligation to follow every lead, but the lack of evidence was becoming stifling. They were also mindful of the possibility that Hayley had simply run away, though this theory was increasingly difficult to believe. How could a 13-year-old girl vanish so completely without a trace? The idea that she had chosen to leave her family without any sign of rebellion or prior warning seemed far-fetched. At the same time, there was pressure from the community, from the media, and from the grieving family. People demanded answers, wanted to know why Hayley had disappeared. Billy, caught in a whirlwind of confusion and loss, began to feel the strain of the investigation's slow pace. She wanted answers, but the frustration of not knowing only deepened her suffering. As the investigation continued, the focus began to shift toward those who were closest to Hayley. Friends, family, and even the neighbors became potential sources of information, or possible suspects. In a small town, everyone is connected in some way. Someone must have seen something, the police thought. Perhaps a neighbor had noticed something unusual in the days leading up to Hayley's disappearance. The search began to feel like a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. Rumors spread like wildfire, with some people in the neighborhood beginning to speculate that someone from their circle, someone they knew, could be involved. One name that repeatedly surfaced during the investigation was Sean Atkins, a man who had connections to Hayley's mother. Though there was no evidence linking him directly to Hayley's disappearance, his name lingered in conversations. Some believed he might know more than he was letting on, though others insisted he had nothing to do with it. The truth was, no one could be certain. The police couldn't make an arrest without evidence, but the sense of growing suspicion added to the already volatile atmosphere surrounding the case. The tension was palpable. Billy's fight to maintain her composure was becoming increasingly difficult as the whispers and the mounting pressure began to take their toll. She wanted only one thing: to find her daughter. But the maze of uncertainty surrounding the investigation made that goal feel further and further out of reach. The truth, it seemed, was buried somewhere in the dark. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Hayley Dunn grew colder, and the weight of uncertainty bore down on everyone involved. Billy, once a woman full of hope and resolve, was now consumed by fear. Every moment without news of her daughter felt like a dagger to her heart. She had been told countless times that missing persons cases were often prolonged affairs, and yet the clock seemed to be ticking faster with each passing day. Billy's desperation reached new heights as she began her own search for Hayley. She canvassed the neighborhoods, knocking on doors, retracing her daughter's steps, and following leads that felt like fragile threads leading nowhere. Every person she encountered seemed to offer a different theory, a different fragment of the story, but none of it added up. Her efforts were in vain, as the police were still unable to unearth any concrete clues. The idea that her daughter had been taken by someone, kidnapped, slowly gripped her mind. A sinking feeling told her that this wasn't just some teenager rebellion, some adolescent phase. Hayley hadn't run away. Someone had taken her. With the investigation stalling and no meaningful developments, Billy's grief turned to frustration. Every new day brought with it the crushing realization that the world had moved on, while she remained trapped in a nightmare. And in a small town like Big Spring, where everyone knew everyone's business, the pressure only intensified. The community began to cast judgment, turning their suspicion toward Billy. After all, who else was there to blame? The media, which had initially approached the case with respect and caution, began to shift. News outlets, desperate for something to report, began to sensationalize the story. Headlines blared about the mysterious disappearance of a teenage girl. Each broadcast its story, painting Hayley's family in a more negative light. Billy was portrayed as a mother who had somehow failed her daughter, who didn't know where Hayley was, or worse, who might have known more than she was letting on. The community, once supportive, now treated Billy with a coldness that left her feeling isolated and broken. With no hard evidence to go on, the theories about Hayley's disappearance began to spread like wildfire. The police had their own hypotheses, but the public's speculation was far less restrained. Some believed Hayley had run away. They claimed she had been rebelling against her mother or had been secretly planning her departure for weeks. Others suggested she had been the victim of a random act of violence, perhaps abducted by a stranger, someone who had been watching her for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then there were those who feared the worst, that Hayley had been taken by someone close to her. The rumors about Hayley's father, Clint, resurfaced, adding fuel to the fire. People began to wonder if he had been involved, if there was something in his past that he wasn't willing to share. Some whispered that he may have been hiding something, maybe even something far more sinister. The notion that a father could harm his own child was unthinkable, yet the town couldn't ignore the strange inconsistencies in Clint's story. His cold demeanor during the early days of the investigation seemed to confirm what the rumors had already begun to suggest. Had he been involved, or was he simply too disconnected from his daughter's life to even care? Meanwhile, Billy was left alone to fight against a rising tide of suspicion. Her grief was turning into guilt, even though she had done nothing wrong. The strain of the investigation, the prying eyes of neighbors, and the relentless media coverage pushed her closer to the edge. She was fighting not only to find her daughter, but to maintain her dignity and protect her own name. As time went on, the police started to shift their focus. They began reviewing the smallest details, the things that might have been overlooked. In the initial rush of the investigation, phone records, security footage from local businesses, and interviews with people who had crossed paths with Hayley in the days leading up to her disappearance all became crucial pieces of the puzzle. Breakthrough came when a neighbor, Mrs. Shaw, remembered seeing a figure outside her house late on the evening that Hayley had disappeared. The person was described as tall, with dark clothing and a hood, and they had been lingering near the street corner by Hayley's house. This was the first solid lead in weeks. The police immediately focused on this new sighting, hoping it would lead them to the person responsible. But as they reviewed other reports, more questions emerged. Who was this mysterious figure? Was it a random stranger or someone from Hayley's life? Could this person have been watching her for some time? And if they were involved, why had they waited until that particular evening? But the breakthrough did little to quell the tension. As the police investigated further, they uncovered several contradictions in the statements of people close to Hayley. Family members, friends, and even Clint had provided details that didn't quite match up. The more they dug, the murkier the story became. One of Hayley's friends claimed she had been with her the entire afternoon, but others stated they hadn't seen her at all. Another person, one who had been close to Hayley's mother, claimed to have heard strange noises near the house the night of the disappearance, but when questioned further, the details didn't align with the timeline. The conflicting accounts caused confusion among the investigators. It seemed like no one's story was fully consistent. The more pieces they put together, the more the puzzle appeared to grow larger and more complex. No longer was this a straightforward case of a missing child. It had transformed into a labyrinth of lies, misunderstandings, and half-truths. At the same time, the suspicion that someone close to Hayley might have been involved grew stronger. Family members, once considered innocent, became part of the investigation. The police had to consider the possibility that someone within the small circle of friends and family had been hiding something. They began looking at each person with renewed scrutiny. As their list of suspects expanded, they found themselves facing a web of potential connections, none of which offered clear answers. With each passing day, the pressure mounted. The media coverage was relentless. Billy was followed by news vans wherever she went, the cameras and microphones always just out of reach. Every time she spoke to reporters, she could hear the unspoken question in their eyes. Did she know more than she was telling? The police were no closer to finding Hayley, and the longer the investigation stretched on, the more likely it seemed that the truth might never come to light. But one thing was certain. The story was far from over. The clock was ticking, and every moment without answers brought Billy closer to the edge. Desperation, suspicion, and confusion had clouded the once clear picture of her life. The more she fought for answers, the more tangled the web of secrets and lies became. And as she struggled to make sense of what had happened to her daughter, the real questions, those that could uncover the truth, remained just out of reach. The days bled into weeks, each one heavier than the last. Billy's hope had been eroded by the cold, indifferent silence of the world. The thought that her daughter's fate might never be answered gnawed at her, and yet she couldn't stop, searching. The answers, the truth, were always just out of reach, until they weren't. The moment came when Billy was least prepared for it. The sun was setting on another day filled with frustration and uncertainty when the phone call came. It was the police. Billy's stomach lurched at the sound of the officer's voice. "We found something," he said. The words felt hollow, distant, as if they belonged to someone else's nightmare. Her body tensed, the pit in her stomach growing heavier with every word. "The remains of a young female have been discovered near the old quarry, about 10 miles outside of town. We believe it's your daughter." The phone slipped from her hand. She didn't need to hear more. She knew. Deep down, she had known for days, for weeks, even if she hadn't dared to acknowledge it. Billy had fought against this possibility with every ounce of her being, and now the nightmare was no longer a dream. The authorities confirmed that the body found was indeed Hayley's. Her remains had been carefully hidden, buried deep in the earth in a remote area far from the town. She had known. It was as if someone had wanted to ensure that her disappearance would never be solved, that the truth would stay buried forever. Forensics revealed that Hayley had been murdered, strangled, a method that left little physical evidence behind. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, just a clean, deliberate act. This wasn't a random attack, nor was it the act of a stranger. Whoever had done this knew her, and worse still, they had taken the time to hide her body, as if to send a message. The police were certain. This was personal. As the news broke, a shockwave passed through the town. The people who had been whispering about Hayley's disappearance, speculating about her mother's role in it, now found themselves questioning the very fabric of their own assumptions. The truth was much darker than anyone could have imagined. Billy sat alone in her house, the echo of the officer's words replaying in her mind, too surreal to accept. Hayley was dead. Her daughter, the girl she had carried in her womb, raised and loved, was gone. The world had taken her from her, and no amount of searching, no amount of pleading could bring her back. The loss hit Billy like a tidal wave. She could hardly breathe. Grief exploded through her in waves of raw, suffocating pain. She thought about the last time she'd seen Hayley, the last conversation they'd had, the hopes they had shared. Everything she had known and loved was now tainted by death and unanswered questions. How could this happen to her daughter? To her family? How could anyone do this? At the same time, something else burned in her chest. Anger. A rage so fierce, so consuming, it felt like it might swallow her whole. She needed answers. She needed justice. Whoever had taken her daughter from her would pay. The uncertainty that had clouded her mind for so long now gave way to an unrelenting drive for retribution. It was no longer just about finding Hayley. It was about making sure her death meant something. Billy stood up, feeling as though the floor beneath her might collapse, and walked to the window. Her gaze lingered on the streets outside, quiet and still. She wanted to scream, to demand that someone tell her why. Why her daughter? Why her? Why this town? But as the anger subsided, a wave of sadness returned. Hayley was gone. No amount of revenge could bring her back. No amount of justice could undo the damage that had already been done. And yet, Billy knew one thing. She couldn't let this go. The person who did this would answer for it. As the investigation into Hayley's murder gained momentum, the police soon focused their attention on a disturbing lead, Clint, Hayley's father. Although initially questioned and ruled out as a suspect, it turned out that Clint had been hiding secrets of his own. In the weeks before Hayley's disappearance, he had been involved in a secretive relationship with a woman from another town. Rumors had surfaced that this woman had been involved in a dispute with Hayley over her relationship with Clint. Tensions had boiled over between the two, and it seemed possible that the woman, jealous, desperate, angry, had taken matters into her own hands. Further investigation revealed that Clint had known about the affair, had been complicit in keeping it hidden. He had tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, all the while feeding into the lies that would eventually bring his daughter's death. The truth, ugly and horrifying, was clear. Clint had known far more than he had let on. Eventually, the pieces fell into place. The person responsible for Hayley's death wasn't a stranger. It was someone who had once been part of her family, someone she had trusted. It was Clint's secret lover, a woman named Linda, who had finally been apprehended. after a police manhunt. She confessed to the crime in a fit of rage, explaining that she had felt threatened by Hayley's presence in Clint's life and had taken matters into her own hands. In her twisted logic, the murder had been the only way to sever the connection between Hayley and Clint once and for all. But even as the truth emerged, it felt hollow. The woman responsible for Hayley's death was arrested, tried and convicted. Clint, though not charged directly, was left with the weight of knowing he had been part of the lie, part of the betrayal that had destroyed his family. Billy didn't want him near her, didn't want to face him again, but she knew she had to confront the reality of it all. The conviction of Linda, the woman who killed Hayley, brought a sense of justice. At least it seemed someone had been held accountable. Billy attended the trial with a hollow expression, her eyes dry from endless nights of crying. The court had ruled. The murderer was behind bars, and for many, that would be the end of the story. But for Billy, the pain never truly ended. The hole in her heart never fully healed. Every time she passed by Hayley's room, every time she held a photograph of her daughter, the grief would hit her all over again. She would never be whole again. But the quest for justice, however bitter, gave her something to hold on to. In the end, it was the pursuit of truth, the need to understand, that allowed her to find a modicum of peace. Billy walked out of the courthouse that day, her mind numb but her spirit strong. She had done what she could for her daughter, and while the pain would never leave her, at least she could say that the world knew the truth. As she looked at the sky, she whispered, "I will always love you, Hayley, and I will never forget." And that was the hardest truth of all.